Okay, just as a reminder, there's a final exam in this class Thursday, December 18th from 7 to 10 p.m. And the exam will be held in room 245 of the Li Ka-shing Center. That's that new center that's over by Pat Brown's Grill. For DSP students, I still haven't gotten information about your arrangements yet, but there will be arrangements, and as soon as I get them, I'll forward them to you. The exam period lasts for 3 hours, but the exam is written as a 2-hour exam. The first hour being a non-cumulative exam, basically a second midterm, and the second hour being a cumulative exam that covers all the territory. We'll do a review session next week in this room at this time on this day next week, Wednesday. And before then, probably by Friday, I'll have a narrative review posted to the course website. As before, there is now a special section of the discussion board on the course website that's dedicated to questions about the final exam. So if you have any questions, you don't get them answered one way or another, post them there and you'll get a response from me. Okay, there's just a reminder of the coverage of the exam, the non-cumulative portion, everything since the midterm. The cumulative portion will include material from the first half of the class, and will also include some material about Lodge's Thinks, which you should have read by now. And there are lots of study materials on the course website. All the lecture illustrations are up there, the lecture supplements, which include and go beyond the lectures. There are copies of all the past exams with the scoring guides. And again, there's this discussion board for you to use as well. All right, let's do something a little bit different today. Last time I concluded my lecture talking about Julian Jaynes's ideas about the origins of consciousness and the breakdown of the bicameral mind. And the essential idea there is that Jaynes is arguing that people became conscious in the sense that we're conscious, not when we evolved and broke away in an evolutionary line from chimpanzees, but actually at some point in human history, roughly about 1,000 BC. Jaynes argues, based on literary evidence, that before about that time, people didn't experience themselves as thinking for themselves. They didn't experience themselves as willing actions. They didn't think about their mental states as representations of reality. Basically, from his point of view, they operated more or less like automatons, doing what they were told or what they thought they were being told by the gods or by leaders or whatever. The argument is summarized in this quote from a later paper by Jaynes, that consciousness is less than 100 generations old. Jaynes didn't have access to this theoretical development, but we can now think about the origins of consciousness in terms of the origins of a theory of mind. And to translate his argument into those terms, the general idea is that having a theory of mind, having an idea that we have minds, that we can use them, that we can control our minds, that the contents of our consciousness will be different from the contents of somebody else's consciousness, and that it's a problem for social interaction to be able to read somebody else's mind, to be able to understand what his or her conscious the mental states are, is a problem that arose only relatively recently. So we can think about the emergence of the theory of mind phylogenetically. Do chimpanzees have it the way we do? We can think about the emergence of a theory of mind ontogenetically. Do little kids have it the way we do? Or we can think about the emergence of a theory of mind culturally. Do Bronze Age people have it? Did Bronze Age people have it the way we do? One of the provocative aspects of Jaynes's theory is that, of course, there's no scientific evidence for it. Nobody can do experiments on Achilles or Hector or Jeremiah or Ezekiel. But he looks at literature as a reflection of how people were thinking about themselves and how people were thinking about thinking as the best evidence that's available to us, which then leads to the question of what else can literature tell us about consciousness. That brings us to the Lodge book, which was written in the context of a provocative lecture that was given in the mid-1950s by an English academic, philosopher, C.P. Snow, who pointed to the emergence of what he called two cultures in Western civilization. Basically, Snow had the idea that there had become a divergence between two different kinds of intellectuals, a divergence that really hadn't experienced before, a gulf between those who are dedicated to the arts and humanities and those who are dedicated to the sciences and engineering. And even in 1956, which was long before string theory and cognitive neuroscience and the genetic revolution or anything else, Snow noted that many people who live in the worlds of the arts and humanities are essentially scientifically illiterate. They really don't know how the world works. And by the same token, many people in the sciences and the engineering professions really don't know too much about the arts and the humanities, and especially don't necessarily pause to consider the ethical or societal implications of their work. At another level, what Snow was lamenting was the loss of a common culture, that somehow those who do work in the sciences and engineering and those who do work in the arts and humanities really don't have much to say to each other or much interest in what each other has to say. Lodge's novel, Thinks, is written as a response to C.P. Snow's thinking about the two cultures, and the two major characters in Thinks are intended to be representations or representatives of these cultures. So he's conjured this fictional university, the University of Gloucester in England, and we've got Ralph Messenger, who's kind of portrayed as a typical cognitive scientist, who's working on the problem of consciousness, and especially working on what somebody like David Chalmers would call the hard problem of consciousness. That is, how do we get a third-person description of conscious mental states, something that is objective and public and scientifically respectable. The other protagonist being Helen Reed, who's a visiting writer in residence. She's a young, up-and-coming novelist in England, who, interestingly enough, as will become clear in a minute, has stepped away from her scholarly studies. She has been working on a PhD on point of view in Henry James. She runs into Ralph Messenger at one point, and he starts talking about how this is a really difficult problem for science to create a third-person description of consciousness, and she turns to him and recites from memory this quote from William James. She waited, Kate Croy, for her father to come, but he kept her unconscionably, and there were moments at which she showed herself in the glass over the mantel, a face positively pale with the irritation that had brought her to the point of going away without the sight of him. Okay, that passage says, that's a third-person description of consciousness. What's wrong with this? Okay, you'll remember too Ralph's reply, which basically says that this is just something that literary people can do. It's literary fiction, not science. That James can claim to know what's going on in Kate's head because he put it there, but all he's doing is relying on folk psychology. But at the same time, Ralph admits that for the time being, by which he means we cognitive scientists, have to settle for knowing less about consciousness than novelists pretend to know. So again, the general idea here, Kate has her own reply, of course, which is to say that for her assumption as a literary person had always been that consciousness was the province of the arts, and especially of literature, because that's what consciousness is about. You invent people, you put thoughts and feelings in their heads, and you see how they react based on what they're thinking. Okay, so again, the general idea here is that there's this debate that runs through the book between Ralph on the one side and Kate on the other side, representing these two general points of view. And then she goes on at one point in the early parts of the novel to say, if you just want a third-person description of behavior, right? It occurs to me that the only kind of literature that wouldn't be open to Ralph's objections would be the kind that doesn't attempt to represent consciousness at all, the kind that just stays on the surface, just describing behavior and appearances. And again, the point being that the whole point of a novel, the whole point of whether it's the English novel or the Russian novel or the German novel or whatever, is to get inside the protagonist's head and to talk about what they're thinking. But I titled this slide "Functionalist Literature" because that, of course, is exactly what some cognitive scientists purport to have to say about consciousness. For example, Dan Dennett, who argues that what goes through people's minds really doesn't matter, that all we really want to do is to have an objective description of what people do and the circumstances under which they do it, a kind of neo-cognitive behaviorism, if you will, without getting inside people's heads at all. And she points out that that would be a very unsatisfactory novel. If you just kind of think about the last novel you read and imagine it being stripped of all references to people's thoughts and feelings and goals and desires, it wouldn't be a particularly interesting experience. Kate's lecture, Kate's unfinished PhD dissertation is on point of view in the work of Henry James, William's brother, by the way, for those who don't know. And that leads us to consider, if you're going to think about literary representations of consciousness, this problem that literary scholars talk about a lot called point of view in fiction. And the essential idea is that every work of fiction is written from a particular point of view. There are, of course, the first person points of view where the narrator of the literary work is also a character in the literary work. And what you get under those circumstances is the narrator revealing his or her own mental states, giving us a first-person description, an introspective description, if you will, of the protagonist's thoughts and feelings and desires. In principle, you can have a second-person point of view where the narrator addresses the reader directly. This is not typically used in fiction. There are examples of it, just not too many. But when a piece of fiction is written from a second-person point of view, what you usually get is a comparison of the mental states of the narrator with the mental states of the reader.